Welcome to Unlapped. We're back ahead of the Hungarian Grand Prix. Sorry to disappoint off the bat, but no Katie George this week. It's just myself, Laurence, Edmondson, and Nate Saunders. And we're coming off a slightly quieter period in our season. We had 3 races back-to-back and then a weekend off. Nate, I mean, how are you feeling right now? I know the last 3 races were pretty tough, but we've got 2 more before the summer break. Where are you at right now?
Well, I'm still digesting the game we watched on Sunday, Laurence, when
I thought you
England.
weren't going to bring it up, but yeah, let's get
No,
into it.
I
We need to.
I feel like it'd be the elephant in the room, or the 3 lions in the room, whichever one you want it to be. Yeah. So I mean, it's a funny part of the year from a Formula One perspective, isn't it? Because I feel like this point in the season, these last 2 before the break, you always feel like everyone's pretty fatigued. The storylines have all kind of been churned through quite a lot. I mean, you can see that with Perez and Sainz and those situations. So I think everyone it's kind of that like nearing summer holidays in school kind of time when you're counting down the time, counting down the hours. But 2 great races to finish off with, so a nice quick distraction from the football that we will never talk about again because I think football's dead to all of us, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we've done our best to try and find the F1 stories of the last few weeks. It has been a bit quieter, but we've got 1 or 2 to get into over the next 40 minutes or so. But remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. If you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, let's get into this. Let's start with the guy who won the last race, Lewis Hamilton, now a 9-time winner at the British Grand Prix. But this seemed to create a few questions I saw on other podcasts, I saw on social media, about whether this is now the right move, that he's leaving the team that just seems to be coming into form and going to Ferrari, which is a team that seems to be going out of form. Now, it's so often in Formula One, fans are fickle, the media is very fickle in the way we cover these subjects. But do you think there's any element of doubt, Nate, that perhaps Lewis has made the wrong decision by going to Ferrari, given that Mercedes is just starting to find this form?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. And you're right, isn't it? Everyone's now jumping on he's made a terrible decision to move. I feel like the Ferrari move has always been bigger than can he win at the start of 2025. It's never been, is he going to be in the best spot to win the championship next season? It's a once in a lifetime opportunity for him to go. And I feel like Mercedes and Ferrari have both been in the same kind of ballpark for a few years now, haven't they? It's chasing Red Bull. And you're right, Mercedes does seem to have taken a step forward, but we kind of keep seeing in these regs that teams, when they have a consolidated upgrade or a consolidated kind of package, they can really move up the order quickly. So I don't feel like Ferrari are completely dead and buried. They're just kind of a step behind Mercedes and McLaren right now. I'd be surprised if there is. I mean, I think Lewis is going there knowing I can go to Ferrari, I can race at the most famous team in Formula One. I can try and break the drought there. Sure, if Mercedes went and won the next 3 championships, I'm sure he'd look back and say I made the wrong call to move. But he's already won 7 titles, and I know he wants that 8th title, but I feel like the pull of winning that with Ferrari is always going to be bigger than winning it with Mercedes. And I mean, on a results level, you could look at it, and his fans might be wishing maybe he'd stayed around. But I don't know. I think, and you're right. I saw all of that this week about has he made the wrong call moving teams, and I just think it loses the bigger picture of what that move was kind of all about with Lewis.
Yeah, that's certainly what he's been saying. I think that's the impression he gave. I did an interview with him ahead of Silverstone. It was some longer term stuff we were looking at about his time at Mercedes. And I admitted that when he made the move from McLaren to Mercedes ahead of 2013, that I thought at the time perhaps he made the wrong move. Of course, at that point, Mercedes
Yeah.
had only won 1 race in Formula One since their return in 2010. It had been a pretty patchy few results. And McLaren had looked like a team that back then were always going to be relatively successful near the front, even if they were starting to tail off. And he said, yeah, I don't know why you guys always question me. If anything, it was proof that you guys should never question me. So I don't want to question Lewis Hamilton. And also, I don't really want to try and get into, what he's thinking. Only he can tell us that. And everything he's told us is that he's happy with Ferrari. But I think it does speak to this great situation in many ways in Formula One at the moment, that if you were a driver completely on the free market, and there were spaces at all of the top 4 teams, which one would you choose? Because you've got Red
Yeah.
Bull,
Tough
you've
call.
got Mercedes, you've got McLaren, and of course you've got Ferrari, and then Aston Martin potentially as well going into 2026. And it got me thinking that if you were in that position and there were opportunities there, where would you go? Which team would you pick?
Yeah. That's a really good question, actually. I think, and there's a great case for all of them, isn't there? I mean, Red Bull, it would depend if Max Verstappen's my teammate or not. I'd probably dictate whether I would go there or not. But yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And the Mercedes example from 2013 is so good because right now you could pick any of those teams and it could be right, it could be wrong. It's kind of the reverse situation of what Carlos Sainz has got going on. You're kind of throwing the dice a little bit and kind of hoping. But you're right to point out what's happening right now because let's rewind it like 3 months, 4 months. I thought leaving I remember leaving the Japanese Grand Prix, flying home and just thinking, man, this can be the longest season I've ever covered because it's just Red Bull so far ahead. No one's got a chance. Then suddenly we get to Miami and then Lando wins. And it's like he just kind of, shook the eight ball around in the, in the magic eight ball thing. And the whole season's been different. And I get the feeling that that could happen again, with different teams. So, yeah, I think right now, I mean, I would probably pick Ferrari out of those four. I don't know about you, but that's just tugging on the heartstrings a little bit. And again, to go back to that point with Lewis, I feel like, and I think I said this when we did our pod on him moving, I feel like you would rather try and fail to win a championship at Ferrari than fail to win a championship with Mercedes for the next 3 seasons. He's won championships and he's failed to win championships with Mercedes. Becoming part of that Ferrari story is just bigger, and he's at that point of his career where he can kind of sit back a bit on his legacy. I mean, his legacy is never going to be. He could go there and not win a race for 3 years. Schumacher came back with Mercedes. No one really talks about that much, do they? People say, okay, cool, he just didn't win, but he's still a 7-time champion, 91-time race winner. So, yeah, I think he's picked well. And which of those four would you pick if someone gave them?
It's really tough. I mean, I'd be trying to look towards 2026 and beyond because you've only got the 1 year in 25. For 25, you probably still going to say Red Bull, but even now it looks like which car would you rather be in? Well, the Red Bull still seems like the fastest, but it's so difficult on the edge. And like you say, if you're not Max Verstappen, can you live with it and get the performance out of it that you need? Whereas the McLaren and even the Mercedes now look far more kind of flexible on different types of circuits and in different conditions and so on. So, yeah, I think I would probably pick Mercedes based on just the stuff we've been hearing about the 2026 engine project. But even then, I'd want to know what's actually going on. I'd want to go and talk to the people direct. And, I mean, that must be the fascinating thing for someone like Sainz right now is that everybody is trying to get him to go and join their team for next year and, of course, 2026 and beyond. And so he must have a really good insight into what's going on at each team. He'll already have a pretty good idea of what Ferrari had planned, even though he would have been slowly kind of cut out of decision-making for next year in 2026. But prior to that, he would have had a fairly good idea of which way that project was going. And, I still sometimes wonder whether with Sainz, the Red Bull option could still be something there, because if they don't find a solution to this Perez issue they've got going into the summer break, and we've heard about how much pressure he's under, the potential for Red Bull to perhaps cut his contract, move somebody else in. Well, Carlos Sainz is still there. And then with Max's future still, I wouldn't say up in the air for 25. It looks clear where he's going to be in 25.
Yeah, it's beyond that, isn't it?
But he wants to keep the option open for 26. And that makes me wonder what's going on with that Red Bull engine project. I mean, is it on the surface they seem very confident. We were lucky enough to get a tour around the facility ahead of Silverstone. It all looks very good, but then if Max is leaving that door open, why would he be doing that if they weren't particularly confident about it? So yeah, I think that's a fascinating thing. So again, just from what I've heard, the surface level stuff, the general vibe that we get in the paddock, it does seem like Mercedes are quite advanced in what they're doing, seem quite a long way down the road in terms of testing with it and everything. But yeah, who knows?
I always wonder with those things, like, and this must make it such a difficult decision. To your point, if you're Max Verstappen right now and you talk to Toto Wolff, he'll say, "What are you doing there, mate? The Red Bull program, I've heard about it. It's a complete joke. It's terrible. Ours is amazing. Like, we won the championships from 2014 through this engine project, blah blah blah." And you're like, okay, cool. And obviously, I don't know the exact specifications and the rules on this, but I'm pretty sure that there are rules where Toto Wolff can't give him and isn't going to give him that information for obvious reasons anyway. He's not going to give someone at Red Bull their engine numbers, etc. Then he goes to Red Bull and he says, "Well, look, I've heard that Mercedes is great," and you have Horner or the guys at Ford say, "No, no, 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 no. Ours is going to be great. The Mercedes one's going to be terrible." And yeah, I feel like you've got to almost trust kind of gut to a certain degree, but I think you've also, I remember Lewis was really impressed when he made that Mercedes move. He had that pitch from Niki Lauda. He explained how the two factory setup was going to work and why integrating it like that was going to be so good, why he wanted to be a customer team, at a manufacturer team versus a customer team, obviously McLaren, Mercedes. So sometimes you've just got to trust that the pitch you're getting is the legitimate one. And I'd love to get a drive. We'll have to get a driver on one day to kind of explain the driver market situation, because the Sainz situation this year has dragged on so long. And I'd just love to sit in on some of those conversations. You know, at this point, what are they talking about? They must have been saying the same things now for weeks and weeks and months. But in his head, it's like, well, I need something here. I need that one magic ingredient that will kind of just push it over the line. So maybe we'll add that when Katie's back. We'll let her know. We'll add that to the future episodes list. Driver market insight. But you're right. It's a fascinating situation. But I think of all the people, just to tie a bow on the Lewis question that you asked me, you're right. We can't guess what Lewis is saying. And he's been so coy, hasn't he, to not talk about Ferrari. And I think that he knows as soon as he mentions Ferrari, the headlines are going to be huge. Everyone's going to want to write about what he says. So if he even hinted or he gave a clumsy quote like, well, you know, yeah, they're not doing great right now, that's all over the press. And he's already starting on the back foot. You know, the Italian media, I feel like, would be kind of in attack mode a little bit. And he just doesn't want to start in a bad place, I guess. So I don't think he'll have any regrets, but I think that question's going to continue, especially if Mercedes win this weekend. Can you imagine? Those conversations are going to get louder and louder into the summer break.
Yeah. Well, one factor in conversations about which team is going to be the most successful going forward is Adrian Newey. You know, of course, we do talk about the drivers moving around so much, but Adrian Newey's future beyond Red Bull, where he'll be released from his contract early next year. And where does he go next? Now, the reason we've been talking about Adrian Newey constantly throughout this season for that very reason, but one reason to bring him up this week is the Goodwood Festival of Speed. We got our first sight of the RB17. If that name sounds familiar, it's actually the missing Red Bull that wasn't built for the 2021 season because they adapted the RB16 from 2020 to race in 21. And so they had this missing name between RB16B and RB18. And they decided to fill it with what is generally being called a hypercar. It's not actually a car you can drive on the road. It's just a track car. But it looks absolutely spectacular. I mean, what were your thoughts when you saw that thing kind of revealed for the first time?
Unbelievable. I mean, I was kind of out of the loop a little bit, you know, this weekend with Goodwood. Wasn't following it hugely, but very quickly that was all over my feed, you know, when they'd unveiled it, and just incredible. And I've got to give a shout out to our friend and colleague at The Athletic, Luke Smith, spoke to Adrian Newey at Goodwood. And you know, Newey was saying that this kind of came from an idea he had years ago. I think it was like 2010, where he was like, if there were no rules, how would I build kind of a Formula One style car? You know, what would, you know, no, there's no inhibitions, no limits to it. And I remember Red Bull years ago putting out kind of a futuristic Formula One car. I forget the year, but I don't know if you remember that. They kind of put out something that kind of looked a little similar to this, kind of, you know, the way the car's curved and stuff like that. Whether or not it you know, is the future of motor racing in that sense, it just looks futuristic, doesn't it? It just looks like the sort of cars that you would get in a sci-fi movie, racing around the streets, weirdly probably driven by a robot inside the car, or self-driven, you know, or fly, or even, you know, the ones that can kind of drive and then just fly randomly out of nowhere. But looked fantastic. And I mean, there's this thing, you know, we talk a lot about the aura and the myth of Ferrari, but I think stuff like that, when you see a car like that, it just adds to that kind of that legend of Adrian Newey, doesn't it? Like, I don't even know if that thing's fast or not, but you look at it and you're like, well, I assume it is, because it looks just so mighty, so powerful. And yeah, it'll be amazing to see. I assume very soon we'll see, you know, laps of it on different tracks and stuff like that. Be amazing to see. I know you're much more of a road car enthusiast than me. What did you make of that? Because you must have been gutted you weren't at Goodwood seeing that in person.
Yeah, a little bit. I probably should have got myself down on the accreditation list for this year, but yeah. Well, one thing that really struck me from Luke's article was that they were putting it in a simulation. I think they had Liam Lawson driving it in the Red Bull Sim. Of course, they just changed all the parameters to what they think this new hypercar can do. And it did a lap time that was like faster than pole position at Silverstone, which is crazy. And you might wonder, like, how on earth can that happen? How can a car be faster than a Formula One car? I thought they were the fastest cars in the world. Well, they are, but they are, of course, like you said, restricted by these regulations. So every time that Adrian Newey or any other F1 designer sits down and tries to map out how they're going to build a car. They're limited by so much of what they can do within the regulations. All of a sudden, Newey had none of that for this project. The only things he really had limiting him were, one, making sure it's safe, because obviously, you need to make sure that there's an element of responsibility there. Even if it's not allowed on the road, there's still certain safety standards you should be hitting. Two, he wanted to make sure two people could fit in it, which is kind of
which is different. Yeah.
And for a car, to make a car go fast, ultimately what you want is just one person, because the limiting factor in so much is making that single person safe. And then, of course, usually the weakest point of a car going that fast is the little blob of flesh in the middle trying to control it. So yeah, that was the other thing, to get two seats in, and they're actually slightly staggered. So you've got the driver's seat slightly further forward and the passenger seat slightly further back, mainly because the widest part on a human is usually the shoulders and the elbows, and they didn't want them getting in the way of the driver as they were sat next to each other. So they're ever so slightly staggered. And then the third big limitation, which is kind of always the case when you're dealing with cars, and we see this in Formula One the whole time as well, is the tires, because you can put as much downforce as you want on a car, but as soon as it starts ripping the tires apart after two corners, it's essentially pointless. So they've worked with Michelin and developed, I think, 3 different types of tires. One is like this super exclusive, I think would be quite limited even to the people that spend $7.7 million on this thing. Track tires that are really for when you're absolutely on the edge, when you're fully up to confidence with the car and you want to go chasing lap times. They have that one. Then they have one which is designed to allow the car to slide a bit more, won't be so twitchy, it's a little bit more forgiving. And then you have a grooved one, which I think is the one which they set people off on. Of course, if it's wet as well, you'd need the grooves. So like the size of this project, I think, is easy to underestimate, because not only is it getting a car built that is in very small numbers, for a very exclusive group of people. I think it's only 50 or so they're building. It's also getting all of the different component manufacturers to work together to make sure this thing can actually happen. And so when we talk about what Adrian Newey is doing now, of course, he's not working on the next Red Bull anymore. He's been kind of slowly withdrawn from F1 projects, although he is occasionally still at races. And he's increasingly focusing on this project to make sure that when he does leave Red Bull, it's in a position that it's going to get across the line, and it's still going to be, like you said, that Adrian Newey car, that seal of approval. But of course, I don't think we can talk about Newey on this podcast or any other F1 podcast without a little look or update on his plans beyond Red Bull. The quotes I saw going around were still that he hadn't made up his mind. But have you had any kind of fresh inkling? Because when it first emerged that he was leaving Red Bull, everyone just jumped to the assumption that it was going to be Ferrari that he was going to go to, because, it's a very obvious step to take for many of the same reasons that Lewis Hamilton has. Even if you go there and it doesn't work out, at least you had the opportunity to work within Ferrari and potentially bring them back to the top. So there's been a few months since, Nate. Any inkling on what he might be thinking?
Well, Spain was quite revealing. Last time I was in the paddock. Sorry, Spain, and then Silverstone even. But Spain, I remember hearing a few things about, this Aston Martin link is getting bigger and bigger. And out of all the options presented to Newey, that was kind of the least sexy of them, wasn't it? We were like, yeah, Ferrari would be great. Him going back to McLaren would be kind of cool. Him going back to Williams, there'd be 2 great stories there, and another great story with Ferrari. And then Aston Martin's kind of like, oh, okay. But the team that Laurence Stroll's putting together, you can very quickly start to put those pieces together. They've obviously just added Andy Cowell from Mercedes. He's CEO, isn't he, now, of the Aston Martin group there. So a lot of moves being made, and I think that Laurence Stroll is determined to make that team into a winner. I think that he's willing to throw a bit more money at Newey. I think he's probably, and I think this RB17 project shows Newey isn't just about Formula One now. He's not just there like, I just want to sit and design Formula One cars. He wants to be doing stuff away from the sport as well. And the Valkyrie that he's already that built with Red Bull and Aston Martin a few years before this, that's competing at Le Mans, isn't it, soon? But I get the feeling that Aston Martin might want to kind of entice him to build another one of those down the line if they can get him. So the chat has become more and more about Aston Martin, but this is the great thing about this situation. We really don't know. I feel like Ferrari, everything I've heard is that Ferrari have kind of cooled their interest. They're not really willing to match what Aston Martin have put out there for him. But at the same time, we know how the driver market, and in this case, the Newey market, kind of works in Formula One. A lot of these deals that we hear, or these kind of interests that we hear, is often just to get more from the other side, more to try and kind of tempt something out of Ferrari. And I think that, I mean, for me, again, this is trying to get into somebody's head, right? I can see why he might want to go to that Aston Martin project. He can stay home. I think Jeremy Clarkson, even on the grid at Silverstone, said, "Oh, he's looking for houses near Silverstone or in like the Oxfordshire region." He's very, which you don't do that if you're about to move to Maranello or start working at Ferrari half the year. But the Ferrari side, I mean, imagine doing what he's just done with Red Bull with that RB17 with Ferrari. Building an iconic Ferrari car. But then again, Aston Martin's a great brand in itself. So to do that for a company like that as well, he's already kind of collaborated with them on the Valkyrie. So Aston Martin increasingly seems like the likely thing. But from everything we've heard as well, and I think you've heard this as well, is September seems to be the first we'll hear about it. It's kind of when his contract allows him to say, I'm going to Aston Martin, or I'm going to Ferrari, or I'm going to wherever. And even then, it doesn't mean he has to have made his call by then. It just is when legally he can kind of free up that call. But it means he's got this kind of 2-3 month buffer until that point. Well, probably 2 months from now, to make that call. And everything that we've heard is that he's in no rush to make that call. I think the people that are in a rush are the people on the other side of the desk in those negotiations. Aston Martin want him to hurry up. Ferrari want him to hurry up because obviously the earlier he signs, I guess the earlier they can make plans. But at the same time, it's not like he can start at a given stage. He's still got to see out his time with Red Bull. So yeah, it's gonna be interesting. But I think right now, if I put my money on it, I'd say Aston Martin. But I mean, do you think the same from what you've heard? It seems to be the prevailing consensus in the paddock, and you know how that can kind of shift around week to week.
Yeah, it does swing around a lot, but that's also kind of the general vibe that I've heard and the movement that seems to be in play. But I kind of believe if he's saying that, I know he probably can't say right now, even if he had made a decision, but I kind of believe him if he says, look, I haven't made my final call yet. I want to take some time. Like, this is a period he can really enjoy. Just spending some time with his wife, traveling. If you follow his wife on Instagram, she occasionally puts photos of them up going in classic cars down to the coast with a couple of dogs in the back. And it sounds like he's really enjoying that. But then this has also led to some questions about, well, maybe this could be it entirely. Maybe this could be Newey retiring. But I'm less, I struggle to get on board with that, because I feel like everything, the way this was planned and staged, and the fact that we already knew the point at which he was going to be free to go somewhere else, and that had already cut into a bitter 2025. All of it seemed to be kind of moving towards Adrian still having one last move in his career in him, and one last place to go. So yeah,
it's like people doing a bank heist movie, isn't it? They have to go. There's always one more. You can't give it up. I feel like a guy like that has been so successful. You can't just walk away. And even if he tried it, I think we'd see him again in a couple of years' time. So yeah, didn't mean to cut across you, but the bank heist kind of theme of that kind of popped into my head.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I imagine it is quite addictive as well. If you're in that role, and also I think he could probably walk into pretty much any engineering project to do with aerodynamics anywhere in the world and would have a place in it. But then, you look at it and you think, well, his expertise and his knowledge and his experience is all in motor racing. The place where he's going to have the most influence and probably get the most satisfaction out of it is going to be Formula One. I don't think there's anywhere else that really gets close to that. So as long as he's still got the willingness to do it, and it does seem like he does. And I don't know in particular, well, I've done the odd interview here and there, but the impression I get from people that have worked very closely with him is that he is super competitive as well. So yeah, I don't feel like that competitive fire has been extinguished within him yet. And as long as there's a set of regulations for him to get stuck into, I think he's going to be keen to do it. Talking of which, regulations and the future and what's coming in 2026, which of course will be a factor in any move Adrian Newey makes. There was a Zak Brown quote over the Silverstone weekend. He talked to a roundtable of journalists on, I think it was a Saturday morning, and he was talking about the 2026 rules. Of course, they're hovering over everyone right now, and basically he expressed some concerns about the fact that we have a set of regulations right now where everyone's converging. We talked about 4 teams racing for victories at each round. So here's what Zak Brown had to say. He said, there is a little bit of concern that it will bring that out of balance, but I think F1 has always been about developing technology. These rules have been in place for the usual terms, so I think we have to stay true to what F1 is and hope that the regulations that the FIA are coming up with, because they're still being massaged. When he says massaged, he means still being worked on and kind of finessed. He hopes those regulations get everyone closer together from the word go. So we pick out the Zak Brown quote because it was said recently, but this is a theme that's running throughout F1 every time somebody mentions 26 at the moment is, what is the sport doing? We're just at a stage where it's all converging and we're getting great racing. Are we about to lose all that going forward?
Yeah, and it's hard not to feel that, isn't it? I mean, especially as this is so engine dependent as well. And I think everyone's kind of got flashbacks to 2014 when that was a very engine heavy, the switch to the V6 turbos. Mercedes was so far ahead, and engines. I mean, I don't know. I might out myself here for being a bit of a dummy, but I think making a comeback on an engine side it just seems much more difficult than doing that on an aerodynamic side for a lot of reasons. If you've made a fundamental misstep with your engine, coming back from that can take you a much, much longer time than simply saying, oh, this concept on the car's wrong, let's change X, Y, Z, and we can do this. You're fully committed to a concept very, very early on. And I think that's the fear. And you're right, like right now, F1, I mean, out of nowhere has just become incredibly competitive. And we've got a recent example of this, more recent than 2014. We've got 2021 into 2022 when we had that amazing season, Max v Lewis. Everyone knows how good that was. And then 2022, the rules changed and Red Bull kind of ran away with it. And it's what, 2.5 years it's taken for that kind of convergence. And in fairness, the convergence has been really extreme. The convergence has been really sudden and has brought everyone really closely into line. But I mean, can we really wait 2.5 years again? Let's say we get, I'm not sure if we'll get a full championship season. I hope we do, but Max is so far ahead. Let's say next year we have another great epic season for the ages with Max and Lando and Lewis and whoever else, the Mercedes guys, whatever, Leclerc as well. Like, don't want to leave him out of out of this fictional championship. We suddenly got that, and then the following year, Mercedes are 3 seconds ahead of everyone, or Ferrari. That would be great for fans of those teams, and it would be great to see. Like let's say it was Ferrari, I'm sure everyone would be quite excited about that. But it'd get boring quite quickly. Once you've seen a team winning, you'd be like, okay, great, Ferrari's won the championship, and they're probably going to win again, and then they're going to win again. It will very quickly. It feels again like the start of this millennium with Ferrari winning, or Red Bulls wasn't so extreme. They had 2 very, very extreme seasons, but then you can look at Mercedes as well. 2014 on. So yeah, a lot of things to be worried about. But I am curious to see how because everyone's talked about, we're looking really, really closely at how to avoid that happening from the off. And I'm not technically minded enough to know how that would happen. But it does seem that this time they've put so much emphasis on that, of finding a way to say, here's the regs, but we've almost got a fail safe here to make sure we're competitive off the bat. But we've talked about it before, haven't we? I think there's some alarm bells and red flags that pretty much everyone in the paddock, we talked about that paddock consensus. Everyone is already saying, well, Audi aren't going to be competitive for a little while under this new set of regulations. Part of that's because, they're coming in late in terms of building their team and stuff like that. But another part of it is it's so dependent on the engine, and you've got to get that right straight away. And the fact that feeling exists already suggests it's going to be a very difficult engine formula to get into. So we'll see. I really hope I'm wrong on that. But yeah, I think Formula One has it's just that nagging fear, isn't it, that we're going to take 1 step forward and then 2 steps back with this set of regs. But who knows? I mean, it could be different. But the fact that so many people are saying it, I think suggests that it is something that a lot of people are worried about.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right on engines. They do just take longer to get right. It's why the engine regulations were published, I think, in 2022, and we're only just getting around to the chassis regulations being published, because these manufacturers do need this extra amount of time to react to changes, make changes, design and develop and test, and eventually bring to the track a power unit, as opposed to aerodynamic surfaces, which are by no means easy. You can still get stuck in lots of potential difficulties and problems in development there. But yeah, in terms of just trying to put together a power unit, it is hard. And while I think there were some lessons learned from 2014 and also especially Honda's involvement midway through this last engine regulation set, where they really struggled specifically with the MGUH, that's the bit that regenerates energy from the turbo. Well, that's been removed, and the idea was to make these engines easier. But problem is when you're dealing with F1 and the performance levels and also the differences in performance being so small, just a few tenths of a second can actually be quite a big difference in terms of where a car is on the grid. But in terms of where you are in a development project from scratch, a couple of attempts can be something that takes a long time to recover. So yeah, so if there is a situation where we're going to see into this 2026 season and one power unit manufacturer is a long way ahead, I think it is going to be tough for everyone to get back involved. And the problem they face now is that we're kind of at situations where both on the engine side and now on the chassis aero side, changes to these regulations are now at a point where they need an element of agreement from all teams. And of course, any team that knows they have an advantage is going to be lobbying against that. Any team that knows it doesn't is going to be lobbying for it. So this kind of golden period where you can set regulations and you should be relatively free from teams' individual, kind of self-interest in what they're proposing has passed. So that's not to say that we're going to go into 2026 and automatically it's guaranteed to be a big split in performance. But the risk is that if that is there, it's going to be very hard for it to self-correct. And as you said, it took these aero regs about 2.5 years. I fear with engines, you're sometimes looking at longer. If you look at what happened in 2014, again, perhaps not the perfect comparisons because lessons were learned from it, but the amount of time it took Ferrari to get back on par with Mercedes, apparently
it was kind of 18, 19 kind of time, wasn't it? And then 19, you've had all the questions around the engine there even. So
exactly, yeah, with questionable things happening. There was also some suggestion that at one point Mercedes were actually helping out Ferrari because they were so stuck behind. And then of course Renault, I don't think ever really got fully on top of these regulations to the point where
and even now, I mean. Even now, Renault's way behind. So yeah, it shows you if you get stuck, you can be stuck for a long time. Renault's probably a bad example. They've really been up against it. But yeah, you're right. You're like spot on. All these things can happen.
Yeah, and I mean to the point that Renault now, it's a story that's been doing the rounds for a few weeks now, considering whether to continue with an engine program into 26 or shift someone else. But that's probably an entirely different podcast, but yeah.
No, I'm not going to touch that one. But it is interesting what you said though as well, because I think this ultimately is it's something that Formula One is always going to struggle with, I think, because it is this tug of war between you want Formula One to be great, you want it to be like 2021 or like the last 5 races have been entertaining, close, dramatic. At the same time, one of the things that sets Formula One aside from every single other open wheel championship is that it is that cutting edge technology. It is always pushing the boundaries. It does always feel kind of better than everything else. And if you suddenly started saying, right, these are the rules now for the next 10 years, or whatever it is, like you started saying this is a 10-year cycle, an 8-year cycle, you don't know what the kind of unseen consequences are from that either. I'm not saying Formula One would lose prestige, but I don't know. Imagine if you started saying, right, you've got to commit for 8 years now to a regulation change. What if fresh out of the gate, Honda come out and they're 3 seconds off the pace? We've seen Honda do it before. Do they say, right, this is going to be 8 years of this? Do we commit to 8 years that will turn this around, or do we say actually let's cut our losses now and get out with the first opportunity? So I really don't know how Formula One navigates this, because that is a really tricky line to walk all the time. You've got to keep the fans happy, you've got to keep the manufacturers happy, and you've got to keep embracing technology. So I don't know. I'm not sure if kind of setting it in the regulations will ever happen. It's got to be 5. Well, I know it's already kind of done in cycles anyway, but I'm not sure. And correct me if I'm wrong. It's not like a set. It's got to be X amount of years before the next change to this or that. But maybe that's a way to go. But I feel like it's not a perfect solution either for anybody involved.
No, I think we do usually know in advance roughly when the next regulations are going to be reconsidered or so on. But you're right. It's not because it's written anywhere in the FIA kind of regulations or sporting code or anything. It's more so that they can dangle something, like you say, in front of manufacturers to say, well, struggling now, but by 2030, we might change it. We might get rid of the electrical element.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas if you knew it was like 6 years later than that, you're like, well, actually, we don't we don't see this as a good proposition anymore. We're gonna, we're gonna get out of here.
That's it. And another thing that Zak said I listened, just listened to that roundtable from Silverstone, and he was saying how fans actually like the changes over time, because if it does get stuck, if you'll say, right, these are the regulations, they're set for the next 20 years, he said that you might end up in more of a IndyCar situation where now there'd be obvious differences. That wouldn't make it a single make formula, but you might end up with a similar situation whereby some of the innovation, the things that some fans love about the sport, do get lost because everyone starts to plateau. And of course, you have these huge, teams of people working at these bases, and to make sure that they're fully engaged and they still want to work in Formula One, you're still attracting the best people. You probably do need to change up the regulations every now and again to set the challenges again. But it's an ongoing issue for F1, and I think it's one that they've never really settled on properly. If you look at regulation changes over the years, for a long time it was about safety, and I think that was very necessary and very important. Often, sadly, it was always reactionary. So it was, say, after the deaths of Ratzenberg and Senna in '94 that things started to change, and then again with Halo, it seemed reactionary to potential incidents that they'd seen crop up. But of course, that's just the way safety often works. But then in recent years, it's been about how do we make the racing more exciting. On occasions in 2017, they said these cars are too slow for Formula One, we need to make them faster, but with no real consideration over the negative side effects. And I think it's always that, it's the unintended consequences, the potential side effects that don't get fully fleshed out, and you end up in situations where you either end up with a team dominating by a long way, or you end up with cars that struggle to pass each other. And trying to balance all of that, it's just this impossible game of 3D chess that you have the FIA trying to play against 10 much better equipped and better, or more staff teams. So an interesting one to think about. And again, I think this is something that we'll just keep coming back to over the next couple of years.
It's not going to go away, is it? Because it is fundamental to the future of the sport as well. So I don't really envy the FIA. I know they get a lot of flack, but it seems like a kind of unwinnable situation, because there's always, by its very nature, there's going to be people upset with it. So I'm not sure how they go on with that fully.
Just hitting one piece of news, pretty much any piece of news we've had since Silverstone. The Haas-Ferrari engine deal links into what we were just talking about, has been extended through to 2028. Nate, you've written up the article. Tell us all we need to know about Haas and Ferrari going forward.
Yeah, so this is Haas and Ferrari. So it's been very very popular within Haas. The Ferrari deal. It's been controversial at points, obviously, when they first joined. It's a pretty extensive partnership, isn't it, between Ferrari? It's not just engine; it's technical partnership as well, and they're continuing that beyond the 2026 regulation change that we've been talking about through to 28. And I mean, this isn't hugely surprising. I think Haas has been you're pretty happy to continue as a Ferrari customer. Obviously, Ferrari's losing Sauber as well when they go to become Audi. So, it strengthens that partnership as well with them. It'll be interesting down the line to see whether they kind of renew that third supply, or that second supply, whichever you want to call it, with another team. Obviously, there's not too many around that need a deal right now. But I think it's pretty sensible. And Haas, obviously, they're taking on Oliver Behrman. It's that Ferrari link has always been super, super strong. And obviously, they're based. They do a lot of work in Italy as well with the Dallara guys. So I think that Italy connection has been really good with Haas. And actually, I know they've not always competed super, super well, but I think the Ferrari link has always served them very, very well when they've been doing well. And they're continuing on with that. And I think, to be honest with you, I'm not sure how much this would have changed with Steiner on board, but a lot of good things happening with Komatsu on board. I'm not saying Steiner wouldn't have got this deal done, but Komatsu kind of came in. None of us really knew what to expect with him, and now they're kind of flying form wise, and they've kind of they've secured their long-term engine deal as well, which again, these things I think have been going on for a few months, but just shows you the mood around that team has just really flipped around since the start of the year, which I think is a testament to everyone there involved. Because I think when Steiner left, everyone kind of assumed the worst, didn't they? They thought, oh well, this is the beginning of the end for this team, and committing to 2028. This is the other key thing. You don't do that if there were questions about whether Gene Haas might sell up anytime soon. You don't commit to that deal if you're thinking about either selling the team or leaving Formula One for good in a couple of seasons. So good news all around, I think, for fans of Haas, and I think it's a great deal, for them. I think it's yeah, it'll be nice also interesting to see in 26 how customer teams start faring, because that became quite a big issue, didn't it, in 2014 to begin with. The customer teams were always kind of a step behind the teams that were giving them engines. And obviously Haas, you'll never expect them to be at the same level as Ferrari, but if Ferrari come out the gate strong, suddenly you're Haas and you're looking at it and you think this is a great situation because we're the number two team of this great engine.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because if you look at the moment, McLaren proving that as a customer team, you can certainly compete with, and I mean, in more recently at the start of this year, beat your kind of works engine partner. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how much that changes. And I think obviously the other thing about the timing of this Haas-Ferrari deal is that you wouldn't want to leave it too much longer to know which engine you're going to have in the back of your car in 2026, because there's a lot of decisions which are currently being made about chassis layout. They can't start on the aero stuff until they get into 2025. They can't start on the aero stuff for 26 until the start of 25, but they can work on some broader stuff, and they'll need to know what they're dealing with. Let's look a lot more immediate term coming up. Hungary. Now, I believe you're flying off there this evening, and it's going to be mighty warm.
It is indeed. I've packed a little pocket fan with me, which is the first time I actually invested in one of these. Laurence had the misfortune of sitting next to me at some of these races. I do get quite warm quite quickly. Great race though, isn't it? Budapest. It's very old school. The drivers love it. Budapest is a great city, but I think it's one of those races where I feel like I know some people say it's quite a processional race, but I think the opposite is true. You get that great run down to turn one. Obviously, DRS makes that a bit more of a factor. But we've had some really entertaining contests in Budapest over the years, so always one I really look forward to. And yeah, just especially right now, I think this is the perfect time to have the Hungarian Grand Prix of all circuits, because we've seen Mercedes have always gone pretty well in Hungary, and Toto Wolff said, didn't he, that the upgrades they bought recently, they weren't really sure if they would work at Silverstone as well as they did, but they were looking towards Hungary definitely, and Belgium beyond that. So I think Mercedes are in a strong position. McLaren, we obviously know where they're at right now, and then Max has pulled out some rabbits out of the hat here before. So this is one of the perfect circuits to go to, I think, right now, because I think they're all going to be super, super close. I think I'm not sure what you think about Ferrari as well, but hopefully they can kind of find their way back into that mix somehow. But yeah, really excited about it. And yeah, it's going to be, I think that it's always the case in Formula One, but this is one of those circuits where, even though everything I've just said, the fight on Saturday is so key for what follows. Because if you can get track position in Budapest, you're kind of halfway there.
Yeah, I think actually this could be a circuit that suits Ferrari. And it will certainly be, I think, a fairly pivotal race in their season as to whether they can basically undo the little kind of missteps they've made over the last few races. They've allowed the other three to pull a bit of clear air. And one reason which I'm slightly more optimistic about here is that one problem that Sainz has been on about again and again with the Ferrari is that in high-speed corners, it's bouncing around, and that's kind of damaging the tyres to some extent, making it unstable in high-speed corners, an issue which it seems like the other three teams have left behind now, and an issue that a number of teams have dealt with since the start of 22, but one that Ferrari's still struggling with. I don't think that's going to be as big an issue in Hungary, and we've also seen that in low-speed corners, medium speed corners of Ferrari can be quick, not always, but it can be. So I think this will be a real test to see whether they really are still in the fight for victories towards the end of this year. Because if they can be relatively quick here, back in the mix, I think when they get to somewhere like Baku, Singapore, those street circuits where you got to ride the curbs as well, it's another advantage towards Ferrari. So yeah, that will be a key indicator, I think, of what to expect from Ferrari over the rest of this year, and maybe silence a few of those questions we were talking about at the top of the podcast about Lewis Hamilton's long-term decisions, because they're probably unrelated to short-term performances.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Charles Leclerc needs it as well, bless him. He was in a pretty rotten mood after Silverstone. But also just on that, like as a wider picture thing as well, these next two races, I mean, I've already mentioned, I think the championship's pretty long gone drivers-wise, but constructors championship-wise, because we know where Perez is at right now and just the struggles he's having, if you can start picking up big points on Red Bull at these races before the summer break, I actually think you can kind of pressure Red Bull into making a call over the summer. If suddenly Ferrari and McLaren take a big chunk out of Red Bull, if Red Bull turn around and say we have to change something, I'm not sure putting Lawson in that car or Ricciardo in that car is necessarily a better thing. So you could end up kind of affecting that championship when we get out of the summer break at the other end and have put Red Bull into kind of a bit of a tailspin driver-wise. So I'm not saying that Red Bull are going to massively react completely, but that will play into the mindset, won't it? If Ferrari come out of this race, or McLaren or Mercedes do, and have taken a big chunk of points out of their lead, Red Bull are already worried about that one. They're not so worried about the drivers' championship, but that other one is, it's starting to become a bit alarming for them. So I think that'll be a nice narrative to keep an eye on as well, because yeah, especially for Ferrari, because am I right in saying Ferrari are still second in the constructors, or have McLaren just overtaken them?
No, for Ferrari, it surprised me when I looked after Silverstone, but
That's right.
Ferrari,
Yeah,
I think it's by just as little as 7 points over
it's
McLaren,
close.
and a good
That's right.
70 or 80 off Red Bull. But you're right, and I think that is what's motivating this Checo concern. I don't think it's anything that anyone within Red Bull particularly wants to have to pile the pressure on, but it does become very real when the Constructors' Championship is up for grabs. And I feel like even a team like Red Bull that's had as much success as they had, the Constructors' Championship is still important, because we've talked about this before. Staff bonuses and so on are linked to it, and of course the pot of money at the end of the year that they get from F1 is very much linked to it. So yeah, I think that's a really important one to keep an eye on, and just added pressure on Checo Perez going into this weekend. I would say right from first practice, he needs to hit the ground running, something that Red Bull actually haven't really been doing at recent races. They've often seemed a little lost in that FP1 session, and they've kind of got it back, usually only for Max, but they've got it back together going into Saturday morning practice after doing some work in the sim. So yeah, I think Checo really just needs a good, solid Friday under his belt. Look, he doesn't have to go and win the race, but he has to be right up there. The only problem now is that because everyone else has drawn up so much, to be even in contention for podiums, you kind of need to be on Max's level, and that's asking a lot.
He seems to be struggling on that, doesn't he, at the moment? I'm just looking at last year's race in Hungary, specifically the standings after that race. I don't think it was, I'm not sure if it's an exact like for like, but I think it's about the same amount of races gone. Red Bull were 219 points clear of Mercedes at this point in the year. Max was 110 points clear of Perez at this point in the year, who was 50 points ahead of Fernando Alonso. So it shows you just how, people might look at it and say, oh, 80 points, it's still quite a lot in the constructors this year. But Red Bull are sitting from a position where last season this was dead and buried. This we weren't even thinking about it. 80 points, there's that margin of error in there, quite in quite a big way.
Well, so I've got to correct myself there, because I've just looked up this year's, and it's 71 between Red Bull and Ferrari, and then an extra seven down to McLaren. So when you're looking at McLaren, which I think is the team that we're all focusing on as Red Bull's biggest threat, just because of the way the performances have been going, yeah, it is about 80, but still, all numbers that could be turned around very quickly. All you need is, say, one max DNF, something to go wrong, like we saw in Australia, or, reliability, it's going to be hot, like we talked about. So all of a sudden, if you no longer have Max scoring points and Checo's continuing on the form he's up, scoring just a handful, then that's a potential big game for someone like McLaren if they can get a 1-2, 1-3 at the front.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that would be, from a storyline perspective, that would be pretty great to cover. So we'll watch this space if that happens. I mean, a Max DNF is asking a lot, because he's been so good for such a long time. But you're right, it has happened. We have seen it.
Well, it leads us perfectly onto our final part of the podcast, a bit I think everyone loves the most, the podium prediction game. I say everyone loves it the most because I was the only person to score a point in Silverstone by
none of us backed Lewis to win.
None of us backed Lewis to win. I think a few of us had Lewis in the top three. You did, Nate. I did. We both had him in third place. And so yeah, that was about as close as we got. But yeah, Max in second place is the only person, or the only way any of us got a point, and that was me. But basically by predicting an entirely different race.
Yeah. We've got Katie's, haven't we? We've got Katie's predictions.
We have Casey's predictions in. I can tee that up just to give everyone a bit of an update, because I know everyone follows this so closely. The scores so far: Katie has 13 points out in the lead. Nate, you have 12 points in second place. Incredibly close. And I'm now closing in with 10 points. So it's now, the top is back within reach for me if I get it right and everyone else gets it wrong. But let's start with Katie's top three, like you mentioned. In third place, she put Lewis Hamilton, fresh off victory in Silverstone. Third place in Hungary. Second place, Lando Norris. First place, Max Verstappen. pretty solid. I can understand why she's gone that way. Could have been similar to what I might have chosen. I'm going to have to mix it up now, but I'll let you go first, Nate, with third place.
Oh, okay. So I mean, my podium could be similar to that, maybe in just a different order. The thing is with McLaren, I really want to give them the win, but we keep seeing that they kind of keep just falling short in these victories. So I think that's actually going to color my my call here. I'm going to say Norris third, Hamilton second, Verstappen in first. So basically the Silverstone Grand Prix if we'd had 6 or 7 more laps, because Max maybe was catching Lewis. But yeah, I think it's going to be tight. I mean, this is one of the hardest races to call. And you're right about Ferrari. I was thinking about putting them in there as well, but a difficult one to do on recent form.
Yeah, I was considering Ferrari, but like you say, just recently it's not been together. I'm actually gonna not have a Mercedes in my top 3 because
wow, okay.
Yeah, when it's gonna be hot, and I feel like
that's true. That is kind of their kryptonite, isn't it? Quite
a
often.
little bit still, a little bit. Well, it certainly was recently, and yeah, maybe opening up the cooling on that car has more of a negative impact on the overall performance. So I'm gonna say in third place, Oscar Piastri, just because I keep putting him in my top 3s and he never gets there. And sooner or later, he's going to get there because he's definitely good enough to be scoring more podiums this year. Lando Norris in second place and Max Verstappen in first place. So we've reverted form here because we've all gone back to what we were doing throughout last year, which is putting Max
first
place, which despite the fact he hasn't won either of the last 2 races, but still,
which was the first time that's happened since like midway through 2022, by the way. 2 back-to-back non-Verstappen wins, or non-Red Bull wins, I think. I think it was early 2022. So just shows you how much of a turnaround this has been. I know it's not. I know one of those was because Max collided with Lando, but still, that could have been a Lando win and followed up by a Lewis win at Silverstone. So really has completely swung around on us.
Yeah, but we're all predicting that will end this weekend.
Yeah, right. None of us think it's going to be 3, which I mean, hopefully proves us wrong. That would be, like we said, for the season, that would be very, very fun.
We will see. I feel like it's going to be an exciting one. Well, of course, there is only one way to find out, and that's to tune into this weekend's Hungarian Grand Prix on ESPN. Nate, thank you very much. Enjoy Budapest. Keep your little mobile fan close at all times because it is going to be very hot indeed. Thanks, everyone, for joining.